Let's talk now to Julian Verlinger, researcher at the European University Institute, Department of Political and Social Science in Florence, Italy. Good morning to you, Julian. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for having me.
Now, Italy was one of the countries that I suppose would have been very negatively affected if a complete embargo was placed on oil and gas like the European Union was considering much earlier on. But I think that there's been some compromise. You're on the ground there. What do you think people feel about this and about the issue of Ukraine versus Russia generally?
Well, I think in the very beginning of this conflict, Europe stood united behind Ukraine and wanted to show a strong response towards this egregious act of Russian aggression. However, today, increasingly, we realize that the mistakes of the past, the amount of energy dependence that has been accrued towards Russia, people have started to understand that sanctioning Russia and embargoing Russia will have direct effects on European consumers. So nowadays, talking about a gas embargo, for example, or an oil embargo, people understand that this will have a direct effect on their lives. So the situation is more complicated than it was in the beginning of the war.
All of this is about Ukraine joining either NATO or the EU, and it doesn't seem to be backing down on that. It wants to join the EU. It sent in the application in spite of being at war. There's been resolutions and all of that. But it does seem as if particularly the older members of the European Union, like France, like Italy, like Germany, are a lot more cautious about admitting a new member under these circumstances. Why do you think that is?
See, the European Union is an old project and let's say a slow project, right? The idea of the European Union is to slowly integrate the continent into an economic, political, and well, really rule of law kind of based entity. Now, this idea of fast-tracking the access of some possible members due to external circumstances of war or catastrophe, I suppose frightens some members who think that rushing in times of crisis may threaten the project as a whole.
Having said that much, do you think, because of course it isn't only Ukraine that is trying to join, you've got Finland and Sweden, and it does appear as if their own applications is receiving much more warm receptions from the EU than Ukraine's. But it would appear that if theirs goes ahead, what's holding it up now, of course, is Turkey's refusal to agree. But if theirs goes ahead and then Ukraine's is stuck, there'll be some accusations of hypocrisy.
Well, there's a big difference between the European Union and NATO, right? Like NATO is a defense pact, which functions on very different logics, like functions on strategies of military cooperation, of security, and these kinds of things. And we have to say that Sweden and Finland, for all intents and purposes, they are already NATO armies, right? Like they're equipped with NATO equipment, their command structure and battle tactics are adapted to NATO tactics. So, really, it's not like there has been a long preparation within NATO to have these countries join NATO. Whereas when it comes to Ukraine joining the European Union, this is a completely different story, right? Like we're not talking about a defense pact here. We're talking about most of an economic and political union. So an economic and political union cannot decide on membership based on the same strategic considerations as in a defense pact would.
I agree with you. And of course, in the course of the war, we have been using these bodies interchangeably, the EU and NATO. Thank you for separating those differences at once. But then, given what is the situation now, Russia appears to also be looking at a situation where this war doesn't completely drag on. Its economy is very, very badly affected by all of this, and its revenue is slowing down. But then so is the economy of the European Union and even other countries that have nothing to do with this conflict at all. So people are talking about food crisis. Do you think that Europe should be worried about some of this unintended consequences, perhaps?
Well, definitely. And I think I think that Europe right now is entering a bit of a dangerous lull, right? It looks like Ukraine is having the upper hand in this conflict, and this may very well be, but things may also change very quickly. So there are things in the short term and in the long term that need to be considered, which I believe are currently not sufficiently considered. Number one, the humanitarian preparedness in Europe. In the beginning of this crisis, the response to the wave of Ukrainian refugees crossing the border was basically very organic, right? Volunteer, grassroots led. And everyone at the time was expecting that by the time this conflict drags on sufficiently, that there would be enough institutional aid and help in place to replace these kind of volunteer grassroots organizations. Now, this hasn't happened, right? Like, we're basically, when it comes to the humanitarian response within Europe, we're still at square one. The systemic issues from the beginning, such as vulnerability to human trafficking, lacks of secure transport, all these kinds of things are still there, right? On the positive side, Europe has started to shift lots of humanitarian aid towards Ukraine. But the short-term effects, let's say the short-term effects, if this war goes different than we assume it may be, could be terrifying. Now, the long-term consequences, of course, are absolutely horrible. Like, we're talking about the first war of aggression in Europe since 1945. The type of social, political, and economic consequences this will have once kind of the shock of the first 100 days is over, I don't think we can fathom it for the moment.
Of course, all of this, as you've correctly pointed out, the humanitarian side of it is not as well reported, is not as well documented as the military or the economic side of it. But even before the conflict in Ukraine, the EU was already battling issues having to do with migration, leading to humanitarian situations and all of that. Do you think this has been a complication to what would perhaps have been an easier process? You talk about the fact that there hasn't been much movement. You're in square one. Is that a follow-through from what had been on ground before, where you had countries like Hungary and others like that who didn't want any immigration at all and were not prepared to deal with this? And then you had countries like Italy, which was already receiving so many migrants and was already at the cusp of having humanitarian problems.
Well, Europe is very bad with handling migration. We've known this from the past, and well, I wouldn't only say bad. I would say, even to an extent, sometimes it feels cynical the way the European Union is handling migration. In this specific case, what I think many were expecting is that this shock of a migration, which like a migration movement, which stems from like a refugee movement, which stems from a neighboring country to the European Union, would in one way or another push countries to move together and organize this issue together, right? Now, certainly lip service has been paid to this idea, and certainly cooperation between European countries has improved as with regards to the 2015 refugee crisis. However, we are not there yet, right? We're absolutely not prepared for what might come. Since the beginning of the war, 7 million refugees and migrants have entered Europe, but there are still 7 million internally displaced people in Ukraine, right? If the war drags on, there is no telling how many people will arrive in Europe, and currently we are not ready to give them the welcome and protection that they deserve as humans.
I can't let you go without asking you to perhaps take a look ahead. Now, you referenced it in your last but one answer when you said in the long term, it's difficult to even imagine what this might lead to if it is not tackled. Now, assuming that all the countries in the EU, one would be right to assume, are already battling economic fallout from this. Some are battling political fallout from this, and therefore that's within their borders. The British, who were at the forefront just like the Americans, the Prime Minister in England survived a vote of no confidence just a couple of days ago. So there are issues within that country as well, along with others. I wonder if this matter of the humanitarian side of it is not dealt with, it might come to overshadow the military, the economic, and all other aspects. Do you think so?
I absolutely think so. At the moment, the story is the following. At the moment, there's a decreased influx of refugees into Europe, which might change at any moment. So let's say the kind of systemic issues that persist with the people that are here do not make headlines because they don't have the taste of catastrophe, right? They don't have the taste of crisis. Within Ukraine, the fronts have somewhat stabilized, which means that on the Ukrainian controlled side of Ukraine, things are not perfect, but they are, let's say, manageable to some extent. We have a complete lack of information on the humanitarian situation in Russian occupied territories, and we have a complete lack of information on the state of Ukrainian refugees, which are in Russia, right? Whether they have gone there voluntarily or whether they were deported, as some people claim. We do not know. So basically, we are at this dangerous moment of thinking that everything is okay, but not planning ahead, right? Like we do not know what might happen tomorrow, and the level of preparedness is absolutely not sufficient.
This is grim news you're divulging here. One can only hope that those who are listening and watching this and who are in charge of policy get cracking very quickly before this really becomes an entirely different catastrophe from the one that is the military situation on the ground. Julian Verlinger, thank you so much for your time this morning and for your perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Goodbye.